The reality, of course, turned out to be very, very different. And so it was apparent to me, and of course to the chair and vice chair, why the director of the CIA did not want access to the detainees. They were covering up a record of horror and torture.
Hi, I'm Mike Hurley.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
We're the hosts of the Are We Safer Today podcast.
The 9/11 Commission was chartered by Congress to investigate the most significant attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Supporting the work of the commissioners, the commission's staff was tasked with reconstructing a complex jigsaw puzzle. What led to 9/11? What happened on that day? What should we do about it? But unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle, the pieces were not in a box. There was no image of what the solved puzzle would look like, and many of the pieces were missing. I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley, and this is the Are We Safer Today podcast.
Last episode, we spoke with Warren Bass, the person responsible for investigating and documenting the response to the growing threat of al-Qaeda by both the Clinton and Bush administrations. But whether it was John Farmer investigating the day of the attacks, or Dieter Snell investigating the plot, or any of the other teams conducting their aspects of the investigation, there was a consistent need for organizational support from staff leadership. We simply couldn't have done our jobs without that strong, effective leadership. Our guest for this episode, Chris Kojm, as Deputy Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission, was one of the leaders responsible for that strong organizational support. Chris's challenge was how to organize and support a talented staff into a cohesive whole and help them complete their work in a very short period of time. Chris Kojm was the perfect person to tackle this challenge. Before joining the commission, Chris spent 15 years working in the Congress under Vice Chair Lee Hamilton. He has worked on the Committee of Foreign Affairs, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, went on to serve as the president of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project after serving as Deputy Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission, among many other notable accomplishments. Chris currently serves as the Director of Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, as well as a professor of international affairs practice. We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
Chris Kojm, welcome to the Are We Safer Today podcast. As you know, we're speaking with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their experience in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks. We've already listed challenges that you've had to uncover, but before we jump into that, a little background. Let's begin with, how did you even come to the commission? I mean, it's not something you can kind of plan for. It's not a job that you sort of say, okay, this is my next step in my career. How did you end up here?
Well, Lee Hamilton called me the day after Christmas in 2002 and said, would I join the staff and serve as his top person, as the deputy staff director? And I said yes on the spot. There really wasn't much to think about. I had worked for Congressman Hamilton for 15 years. I would have never stopped working for him in the Congress except he retired. It was a wonderful job. He was and is a wonderful man for whom to work, and so it was very easy. I said yes.
Your position on the staff was you were the Deputy Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission. What was that? What was the job? What were you responsible for?
Philip Zelikow, the staff director, and I had both worked at the State Department, and so the example with which we were familiar was, how bureaus are run at the State Department, where the assistant secretary is the lead person and the spokesman, and the principal deputy, if you will, is responsible for operations. Certainly at the outset, everything was operations. It was finding space, working out a budget, working out a staff plan, hiring people. That moved into the hearings and investigation phase, and certainly with respect to hearings, I took the lead much more than Philip did, because I spent my whole life organizing hearings in the Congress for Chairman Hamilton. And then I took on a very strong editorial role in the latter part of the commission's work.
You mentioned all that setting things up. You got the phone call right after Christmas. The commission didn't really get running immediately. And there's not just this commission in a box. You don't just go to Home Depot and buy the commission and it's going.
You're talking Christmas 2002, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right. There wasn't exactly a blueprint for setting up this specific commission. You had some huge challenges, a huge task. How did you approach that kind of, how do we get started and where do we go?
Well, as your question indicates, Barbara, it went very slowly. Our first people really didn't come on board until May because the clearance process was complicated. Even those who had clearances previously had to get them revalidated. We really were not getting organized in a serious way as a staff until the summertime of 2003, which of course was to great consternation of the families who were looking for results, quite understandably. But just simply standing up an organization took the better part of half a year.
Yeah, Chris, I want to drill down on that a little bit and follow up on Barbara's questions. I'm not sure the public fully appreciates that. So commission gets created, but it starts from nothing. So you have to get offices, you have to bring the personnel on board. It has to be the right personnel to have the skills that you need to conduct the investigation. You have to get the office equipment, the computers, and all that kind of stuff. So describe that a little bit more.
Well, you've described it quite well. It's just an unending sequence of administrative tasks, some of which others can do, and we had a wonderful chief administrative person, Diana Campagna, and great support staff, but at the end of the day, you've got to sign contracts and inspect spaces and assign offices. And then, of course, the task of identifying, reviewing resumes, and hiring 80 people is a very considerable task because, in essence, Philip and I were doing that. And once team leaders were in place, Mike and Barbara, we look to you for helping to identify people, but at the end of the day, we still had to go through the interview and selection process.
The commission was formed in a highly partisan environment, but the chair and vice chair were committed to bipartisanship.
Just say a word about that, the context for our listeners. What in 2002, 2003, what was going on that made things so partisan in the country then?
It certainly was perceived as highly partisan at the time. I think we're in a more partisan and toxic environment now, but you don't know what the future is going to hold. Certainly in 2003, all of our principals on the commission felt that it was a highly partisan time, perhaps the most partisan time in their professional lives. You had the Iraq War and a perception that the administration in fall 2002 midterms had run on the war against Democrats and that Democrats were soft on Saddam or not willing to stand up for America, etc. At least those were the perceptions. And so this led to a very bitter and partisan environment, particularly as the reasons for the Iraq War did not seem to materialize with the founding of weapons of mass destruction. And that was just on the international side. And there are deep divisions on all kinds of domestic issues. So it was both necessary and essential for the staff and for the commissioners to focus on the task at hand. And in some senses, it was not that hard because the task was so enormous. It took up all of your bandwidth and mental ability. You had no time to focus on distractions outside of the commission work.
During the entire lifetime of the commission, we were headed towards the 2004 presidential elections, too, which were, of course, highly contentious.
Yes, indeed.
Well, in fact, the timing of the commission originally was scheduled to end earlier because of concerns with the administration about when our report would come out.
Correct. The administration, in its agreement with the Congress on the life of the commission, wanted it to end in the spring of 2004 in the belief that whatever the results were, they could be managed over the summer and fall campaign, that more time was better to manage whatever those results would be.
How'd that work out with the staff? I mean, were the staff picked to support particular commissioners? Were they looked at whether they were trying to divide the staff evenly among Republicans, Democrats? How did this work?
That's a great question, Barbara, because here the example of the chair and the vice chair was profound and critically important to the success of the commission. Their example of bipartisanship and their expectation that that would be followed by other commissioners and throughout the staff was essential to the commission's success. And the chair and vice chair also were insistent that there be no separate staff for individual commissioners. It would be a unitary staff reporting to the commission as a whole. So that was a powerful example. And the executive director, Philip Zelikow, and I certainly were dedicated to finding the very best staff. And we did not look at party affiliations. In some cases, it was obvious what people's political affiliations were. So, for example, if you had worked for a Democratic chairman in the Congress, as a number of staff did, Philip, to his credit, he said, and I think he was accurate in this, that at the end of the day, we probably ended up hiring more so-called Democratic staff than Republican staff, and that was simply a factor of the counter-cyclical nature of Washington life, because Republicans were working in what was then the administration led by a Republican president and a Republican-led Congress. So more Democratic staff were out of jobs, and Philip never focused on people's political backgrounds. Of course, I didn't either.
Chris, I just want to paint the picture of, in broad terms, the backgrounds of some of the folks on the staff. So you had the chairs and Philip Zelikow and you brought on board people from the United States Air Force, from the Army, from the State Department, of course, from the Department of Justice, from CIA, from many different agencies, not to mention PhDs in history from distinguished universities. And say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Just to add to the luminaries, we had the former Deputy Director for Analysis from the CIA on the staff, heading a team. We had the former Attorney General of the state of New Jersey on the staff, in addition to the sitting current Deputy Attorney General of the state of New York. Enormously accomplished and talented people. The General Counsel, Dan Marcus, was number 3 in the Department of Justice in the Clinton administration. In addition to the agencies Mike identified, we also had Treasury and intelligence community representatives, people from Customs and Border Patrol at that time. FBI. And so very talented investigators and a lot of people who had worked in the Congress on the intelligence committees, on transportation committees, foreign affairs and armed services committees. So we had really a multitude of talent.
And looming over all of this was this deadline that was always in front of us.
Yeah, the deadlines, the time pressure was extraordinary. All of us felt it every week, even as we were holding hearings in the fall of 2003. They were still expert and background hearings. They were not yet fact witnesses in any way to 9/11, and so we got a lot of grief from the families and from observers writ large that, well, when is this pokey commission going to get going and start doing significant work here? And that changed in January when we started holding our first hearings with former administration officials. That became quite a change in public perception, and certainly by the time of our April hearings with Richard Clark and Condoleezza Rice and George Tenet and former secretaries of state, the hearings were quite electrifying.
So we've talked about having this great staff. But, once they started doing the work, we had revelation after revelation of things. Were there things that surprised you that the staff uncovered?
Oh, for sure. It was just extraordinary what you learn when you finally have access to the records and to the documents. Barbara, some of your own work on the FBI-CIA relationship and just how It's heartbreaking to sit here now and just how many occasions arose when it would have been possible, should have been possible, for information to be shared, and it wasn't. So that was really tragic. And the individuals in San Diego who became future hijackers would make phone calls back to Yemen, and those numbers didn't get followed up on.
We learned they were living in a place that they rented from an informant to the FBI.
Yes, that's right. An informant for the FBI rented to 2 future hijackers. It was the point of some sensitivity, of course, to the FBI. Then, of course, things we learned through the detainee interviews were quite startling as well, and the role of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in the preparation of the operation and his grandiose plans for hijacking 10 planes and on both coasts of the United States, and him landing the plane and seeking to be the hero of his own terrorist drama. So we learned a great deal through the documents and the interview process.
You mentioned interviews of the detainees.
Yes.
But the commission staff didn't get to directly interview the detainees.
No, not at all.
Can you tell us a little bit about that whole process?
Absolutely, and this is a very vivid recollection I have. Philip and I went with the chair and vice chair to the CIA, this was around Christmas time, 2003, to see George Tenet.
Who at that time was?
Who was the director of the CIA.
Okay.
So to meet with the CIA director. And Lee Hamilton had known George Tenet for a long time, because George had been a congressional staffer long before he came into work first the National Security Council and then as CIA director. So they're having a very affable conversation, and George is being very expansive. He wants to help. He wants to provide documents. He always gives the appearance of being forthcoming. And then the conversation turns to detainees. And that door slammed shut. He just said, no, it's not possible. There is no way that the commission is going to have access to the detainees. I will do everything in my power to prevent that from happening, and I know the White House supports me.
What was the rationale that he provided for that? Did he provide reasons?
Interference with ongoing investigations into potential operations against the United States. So it was for the security of the country, only we can conduct these interrogations.
It might be disruptive to the rapport that the questioners supposedly tried to establish with the detainees and things like that.
That was the representation. The reality, of course, turned out to be very, very different. And so it was apparent to me and, of course, to the chair and vice chair why the director of the CIA did not want access to the detainees. They were covering up a record of horror and torture.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
Was there any kind of resolution that allowed any way for the commission to get direct information from the detainees?
Well, a process was worked out which was useful and provided some information. It was suboptimal, and that is that commission staff could draft questions. They would be submitted, and those interrogating the detainees would ask the questions and relay answers. Obviously, that's suboptimal for the reason that the attorneys in this room know well. There's no chance for follow-up. There's no chance to evaluate what's said contemporaneously. There's no chance to see physical reactions of people to the questions. Having said that, we, the commission and the staff, nonetheless learned a great deal from what was provided through those questions. Of course, information under torture, which is what occurred, is doubtful at best, and therefore commission staff engaged in a process of cross-checking and referencing and seeing whether there was corroboration for the information provided through the detainee interviews. And there often was, but not in all cases. And when there was not corroboration, we tried to represent that as such.
Did the commission have any idea under what conditions these questions were being asked at the time?
No contemporaneous knowledge. That all came later.
You know, when you're talking about getting all this information, whether from the detainees or so much other information the commission got, so much of it was highly classified, including the President Daily Brief and other materials. How surprised were you that we as the commission were able to get that declassified and so that we could have a report that could be bought in any bookstore in the country?
I was astounded. Having worked in the intelligence community and having been at times the chief classification officer at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research when I was the chief officer for the day, I just knew that every incentive in the United States government then and now is to classify and not declassify.
Overclassify sometimes.
Always overclassify. That's just the nature of the beast. And so I was astounded at how much came into the public record. And that's really a reflection of the commission and its power and impact. There's such a great yearning in the American public for the entirety of the 9/11 story, and such great interest in the commission's work, where when the hearings were held, 70% of the American people said they were following the work of the commission carefully.
That's astonishing.
You don't get 70% of Americans to agree what time zone they're living in. Let's be blunt, that political pressure on the administration forced the vast amount of declassification that occurred. It would not have occurred under other circumstances. There was just very little ability for the national security agencies to push back on that information. And so, as Mike and Barbara know, details of covert operations involving potential kill activities became part of the public record. Those are the kinds of things that would not come out 25 years after they occur or probably forever.
Some of the most classified documents that the U.S. government ever produces.
I think, yes, that there's no parallel before or after of the amount of information that became declassified that occurred in the 9/11 Commission report.
Part of it was the whole process where we got particular agencies to designate someone who had the authority to declassify. And I remember in our conference room giving drafts to the relevant agency representatives and having them all there at almost declassification parties, and how much happened very quickly because of the deadline.
Yes, and the White House here was helpful. It pushed because the last thing the White House wanted was another press conference with the chair and vice chair saying, well, we are just stymied here. The administration is blocking declassification.
I'd say with the chair and vice chair and the families of the victims of 9/11 lined up behind them.
Right, exactly, because there had been a press conference like that on access to documents before. I can't remember now. Maybe the fall of 2003. And exactly as Mike describes, the chair, the vice chair, the families, and noting with carefully and with a tone of regret rather than accusation that documents were not forthcoming. But every reporter in the room knew what the story was and wrote blistering headlines condemning the administration. And the White House didn't want to have that happen again on declassification.
Chris, there were 10 commissioners, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, and they didn't all live in the Washington, D.C. area, but they would come together regularly for commission meetings, and I think you and Philip Zelikow would attend many of those.
Yes.
Do you have any memories of particularly interesting deliberations the public might want to know about?
Yeah, let me speak to the tonalities. At the outset, early in 2003 and through much of the summer and fall, it tended to be stilted discussions with people defending positions that were fairly predictable. The dynamics in the commission changed over time in a lot of ways. Lee and Tom and then individual commissioners would host dinners, and so the commissioners would get to know each other socially. And they also had a sense of being forced together and getting buffeted by critics left and right and center and the families. And so the 10 were all pushed together and realized that they had a common purpose in working together, which they did. The dynamic changed over time as they grew to know each other and trust each other, and at the end of the day, rely on each other.
I know Mike and I both remember very clearly the day that the commissioners voted unanimously to accept the report, no dissents, no addenda, any of those kinds of things. Were you there in that room, and what did you think when that happened?
Well, yes, I certainly was in the room on the day where the 10 commissioners decided to support the report. And Tom and Lee had talked to the other commissioners. They had a sense of how the vote was going to go, but they certainly had no prior knowledge of how everyone was going to vote. And so it was a moment of high drama when 10 commissioners agreed. There was a moment of silence and then really jubilation.
Relief.
Yes, relief indeed.
Chris, how important was it that it was unanimous, that there was no dissenting opinion that was written into the report?
The chair and vice chair felt very strongly about that, and of course they were right to do so. Lee had been working on many reports over 34 years in Congress. And when you have a majority view and a minority dissent, you can be pretty sure that that report isn't going to have a lot of impact. So they were keenly interested in a document that would propel change. They knew, and every commissioner knew, that a unanimous vote was important, that you couldn't make a difference as a commissioner if you weren't on board that train at the end of the day, because whatever you wanted to achieve could not be achieved unless the totality of the recommendations were supported by all commissioners present.
So I think one of the questions that's really important is what made the commission's work so impactful in the end?
This was an epical event. You can ask anyone who is alive where they were that day and when they heard about 9/11, and they'll tell you they remember. When I was a child, when we were young, you remembered where you were when you heard that JFK was shot, or my parents for Pearl Harbor. So the level of public interest is just at a level of intensity that no other contemporary event could match. And then the point that the chair and vice chair emphasized, the clarity and simplicity of the writing and telling a very complicated story as simply as possible and telling it as a story, because every reader, every listener responds to stories, and this, after all, is a compelling story and was written, as others have noted, in novelistic form. Those were two very important aspects of the commission work, and they powered the third. The interest in the Congress and in the administration in the commission's recommendations derived entirely from the level of public interest and support.
I think a lot of people don't really understand that because the book was going to be publicly available in the bookstores, that in fact we knew how long the report was going to be before it was even written because we had the covers made, we knew what size it was going to be. I mean, isn't that kind of unusual that you know how long your report's going to be before you get started?
That's true. That is very unusual in a government document. But the space limitations, in fact, were a great benefit to the commission because you had to always distinguish what is essential to telling the story and what is interesting but not all that important. And any good editor can tell you that you always make a report or a story better by cutting, seldom by adding. And then, of course, we had a great crisis at the end when we had paid great attention to page lengths but had failed to take into account all the footnotes. And so to accommodate the text in a readable font, we had to move all the footnotes to, I think, a 6-point font, which is readily readable with a magnifying glass.
Well, getting the report out, I mean, can you talk a bit about, the rollout of the report and making sure that it had the kind of impact that was envisioned for it?
A great deal of attention was focused on the rollout. We knew that the one day we had, we knew we'd have a 24-hour news cycle, and we wanted to make sure that the event of the rollout would lead to much more attention and impact, which of course it did. And so it was highly choreographed with Tom and Lee briefing the White House, briefing then presidential nominee John Kerry, briefing congressional leadership, briefing the House and the Senate. And then in the late morning, I think it was 11 a.m., was the public rollout at the Carnegie Mellon Auditorium in the Department of Commerce, a lovely, grand setting for an event.
Sort of exactly as planned. The day the report rolled out, the bookstores across the country had stacks and stacks of hard copies of the report available for the public, which I found really pretty extraordinary. Chris, something unusual happened after the commission closed its doors. The commissioners decided to create something called the 9/11 Public Discourse Project. What was the project and why was it formed? What was it set up to accomplish?
The 10 commissioners felt strongly that the report was an action document and that there were 41 recommendations that the country should act upon. Many of them would require legislation or changes of policy. They certainly all required action. So the 10, and Jamie Gorelick was a key driver here, felt strongly that the 10 should incorporate themselves as a 501c3, a nonprofit organization, to continue the work of implementation of the commission recommendations. And so Jamie Gorelick is a high-powered lawyer at, where was she, at Wilmer Cutler at the time. So she got a draft of incorporation for us. She got to work on our licensing process and dealing with D.C. government authorities. And so we got incorporated as a nonprofit in record time. I came to be involved with the Public Discourse Project. The rollout was July 22nd, and then by 2004, and by September 2004, this nonprofit was up and running, so I was engaged in things that were very familiar to me, finding office space, working on budgets. And thanks to Commissioner Gorelick and a few others, they did the heavy lifting on fundraising. Governor Kane helped out a lot, too.
So this wasn't a government organization.
No.
It was a private organization.
Yes, a nonprofit.
Was there a notion that in the past commissions had done their work and filed their sometimes voluminous reports, and there's a press splash, and then they sort of get, exiled to the dusty bookshelves of some library someplace, and that they just thought that the recommendations were so important that they didn't want that fate to befall the 9/11 Commission report?
Well, that's right. It was a break in tradition. Commissions, Mike, exactly as you say, would give their considered advice, file their report, and go away. In fact, Tom Kane tells a funny story. And during the life of the Public Discourse Project, he was up on Capitol Hill, and he ran into, I think he was majority leader at that point, Tom DeLay, who said to Tom Kane, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here." And he said, "Yes, we are. We're working on implementation of the recommendations."
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
I remember there was in August, even during the normal recess of Congress, but in August of 2004 and through September, there was a flurry of hearings in which Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton, the chair and vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, now the heads of the Public Discourse Project, made one appearance after another, and other commissioners did as well.
It was just an extraordinary busy time, so there was no moment of rest after the rollout day. There were briefings and testimony, and Philip Zelko and I testified several times as well. But we were very, very busy. We were preparing testimony for the chair and vice chair and answering questions for the record for them. So the Public Discourse Project was a full-service support operation for the commissioners as they testified and spoke out in support of the commission recommendations.
I think in some circles there was this attitude, though, and I guess maybe I'm talking about the White House, the Bush administration, and as you just sort of pointed out in your anecdote about Tom DeLay's meeting up with Chairman Kane, but the attitude of, can someone rid me of this meddlesome priest, kind of?
Yeah.
Why are they still here?
Yeah, there was that sense. Why are they still bothering us? Yes, I sense that some. And cooperation from the administration trailed off, but never went away because they understood that even this public discourse project could make life miserable for them. And they recognized that.
It didn't have legal authority.
No legal authority.
But it certainly had a persuasive authority. And I think that the fact that the first legislation incorporating many of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission was signed that December by President Bush. I mean, going from report in August to legislation in December, from your experience on the Hill, is there anything even remotely like that?
No, that that just doesn't happen. You know, a comparable reform in the Defense Department, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, took decades. And it was a long slog. So for the commission to have a bill signed into law in a matter of 5 months is really quite remarkable. And it's a testimony to Dennis Hastert, the former speaker, who had great opposition within his conference, but found a way to work out differences, in particular with Armed Services Committee members, to achieve that outcome. And the White House, to its credit, understood that it would be better off in front of these reforms and helping to shape them rather than being seen to resist. And that attitude helped as well.
This was the biggest reform of the intelligence community since 1947.
Yes.
And there were a lot of oxes being gored here by creating a director of national intelligence, which would have taken authority away from the individual who normally would be head of CIA and head of the intelligence community. And there were a lot of others who were going to lose authority and responsibility. How do you get something like that done in that few months?
Let me precede that by talking about something I didn't mention, and that was internal committee deliberations on the creation of a director of national intelligence. There was much discussion back and forth. Lee Hamilton was an advocate in principle. He just didn't think it was doable. He just thought, we've been trying to do this for decades. Just not sure this is going to work, although he was a supporter. Commissioner Slade Gorton opposed it. He just thought, as did John Lehman, that we were just going to build another layer of bureaucracy and it's going to be bound to fail because existing institutions will sabotage it. But everyone came around to the idea that creating a director of national intelligence was really important because the record showed that the director of the CIA paid no attention to leadership of the community because leading the CIA, after all, is a very hard job. There's little doubt in my mind that the crisis of 9/11, followed by the embarrassment of the National Intelligence Estimate on weapons of mass destruction with respect to Iraq, really put the CIA on a back foot, and it was just not able to oppose this rushing train of reform and the creation of a director of national intelligence. So your question was, how do you get this into law? Well, the directors of the intelligence committees and the leadership supported it thoroughly. They had seen the failings firsthand for themselves, as had the American public, and that change was necessary, that agencies did not have unity of effort and singularity of purpose, and as Commissioner Gorelick put it, we needed a quarterback to actually call signals and run plays. Somebody had to be in charge.
Chris, the Public Discourse Project allowed commissioners also to kind of traverse the country a bit to educate on what the 9/11 Commission had found and about its recommendations to keep the country safe. And I think that helped in this overall effort, too. That was, a very deliberate effort to bring the public into what the Commission had done.
Yes, commissioners traveled, staff traveled, I traveled. Mike, you traveled, did a lot of traveling and speaking on behalf of the Commission's recommendations.
One memory I have is that the Public Discourse Project got a request from a high school English teacher in a small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan called, I think the town is called Engadine, I might be mispronouncing it, who asked to have a representative of the commission come out and talk to his class because he had made the 9/11 Commission report required reading for his English class. And so we went there, and the K through 12 student body, K through 12, was maybe 150 maximum, and the 11th grade class was maybe 12 or 15 students. But they were paying attention out there to the work of the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah, and you went out there and met with them. That was pretty remarkable.
Pretty interesting thing. The Public Discourse Project also produced, I think it was in December 2005, just before it closed its doors, so something like 16 months after the 9/11 Commission report came out, a series of report cards. What was that all about?
How do you communicate with the public? I mean, the commission was gone. The general public wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to something called the Public Discourse Project. So how do you gain public attention? Well, you issue a report card. The beauty of a report card is you don't have to explain anything to anybody.
Everybody in the country knows what a report card is.
Everybody knows what it is. Everyone knows what an A is. Everyone knows what an F is. So you don't have to have a laborious narrative of critiquing, of implementation, of this and that. So it was simple. We'd have all the recommendations and then a grade. And
this is based on a series of, they weren't hearings in the congressional sense, but calling together experts to discuss these particular issues and the state of what changes had been made.
That's right. And the Public Discourse Project, and including work by yourself, Mike, would investigate how various government agencies or the Congress were doing with the recommendations. And yes, we pulled together hearings where we couldn't compel anybody to testify, but we would always get experts, and sometimes administration people would come to talk to us. So I think we had a pretty good basis for evaluation and grading.
It wasn't the kind of report card you'd want to bring home to mom and dad.
No, there were some nasty grades in there.
I think that, as I recall, I think that the Department of the Treasury got one fairly high grade, and they waved that around as a badge of honor.
A- in the terrorist financing.
Oh, you remember, Barbara.
That was
Good for you.
That was the best grade, and some people said that reflected grade inflation. But there were a number of Fs and incompletes.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the Treasury Department, that mention of an A- on the report card was on the website at least a decade later. So
that's funny.
So I'd like you to sort of reflect back on your time on the commission. You face many challenges as the deputy director that you've talked about. Thinking back now, would your experience be different if you were trying to do this today? And could it even be done today?
Well, to your last question first, regrettably, it's not at all sure that it could be done today. As everyone is aware, there was an effort in the Congress to create a 9/11-like commission in the aftermath of January 6th, and it failed to get sufficient votes for closure in the Senate. It got a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, but not 60 votes. And so the bill died. It is an open question whether the work can be replicated. But as to myself, if I were in such a position again, two things stand out for me that I would do differently. One is internal communication. I am more persuaded than ever that the role of a leader in any organization is communication, both to listen and to keep people well informed. I don't think I did a bad job of it during my time as the deputy director, but I'm absolutely mindful of the importance of that every day in an organizational setting. And related to that, the world of 2022 is mighty different from the world of 2003 and 4. And of course, that relates to social media. So the public affairs team on the commission would not only have a public affairs director and assistant, which we did, but we would have to have a whole social media team, both monitoring what's being said about the commission and responding in real time to every tweet and comment. That would just be essential. I mean, every successful organization today has to be plugged into that world of social media awareness and participation.
Chris, you've posted your work on the 9/11 Commission and the Public Discourse Project. You've been chairman of the National Intelligence Council, kind of watching threats in the world, and you're now a professor at George Washington University. Suffice it to say, you pay more attention likely to foreign affairs than the average American. Are we safer today, in your view? How do you assess where we are post the 9/11 Commission's work?
Without question, we're safer against all of the threats that 9/11 manifested. That said, there's a big asterisk here because we have domestic threats of terrorism that far exceed incidents of Islamic terrorism and have for several years. So,
I think that the director of the FBI has testified to that.
Yes, has testified to that for
Before
several
Congress.
years now. We are safer, but threats are different, and they surely have not gone away. They are significant.
Overall, do you think the agencies are communicating better with each other, have solved
Absolutely.
some of those problems, sharing information better? Both agencies within the United States, but also with our allies.
Without question, communication is far better internal to the U.S. government and, as you note, Mike, quite correctly, superb communication with lots of allies and partners. And in fact, we have helped Europe in very significant ways address the terrorist threat it faces.
I hesitate to raise the issue of whether Congress has reformed itself and its oversight. You know why I'm laughing about that, Chris?
Well, the Congress has not yet reformed itself. That's the one great disappointment in the Commission's recommendations. Congress got on board and was happy to reform
Everybody else.
and did a good job of it. But internal reform is hard. A lot of oxes would have to be gored to do that, and it hasn't happened yet.
Some of our listeners were not even born on September 11th, 2001. I'm sure you even have students
Yes.
who were not born or were so young at that time. What would you say to them about the work of the Commission and its relevance today?
Well, the message I would want to leave with them is that bipartisanship did happen, is possible, and is worth doing, and can bring the country together again. The other important message is the one of democracy and self-reflection. When governments screw up, which they always do, a democratic government investigates itself and tries to find out what happened and to come up with steps to improve and make things better. The story I like to use with my students, and this is a story told by Congressman Elbridge Gerry, whom we know for the word gerrymander, congressman in the very earliest days of the Republic. And he said the following: "A monarchy is like a great, beautiful sailing ship. It looks very powerful until it hits a rock, and then it sinks. A democracy is like a raft. Your feet are always in the water, but you never sink." And so the lesson for my students, and that I like to leave here, is that, look, democracy, it's querulous, it's ugly, there's a lot of contention, and Lord knows we have lots of polarization. But as a democracy, we do have the ability to reflect on what went wrong and to make corrections and to keep on in our very difficult endeavor to work toward a more perfect union. And that's what the 9/11 Commission was all about.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate your perspectives on that and joining our conversation today.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Chris Kojm's challenge was how to help organize, staff, and run a huge investigation with the goal of producing a comprehensive report that was accessible to the general public. The 9/11 Commission's report was the end of the Commission's work. It was the only best-selling book ever published by the federal government. Even today, sales of the report and free downloads continue. Thank you for joining us for our discussions regarding the most extensive investigation in U.S. history as seen through the eyes of the people who made it happen. Thank you for listening to the Are We Safer Today podcast. This was made possible thanks to our sponsors, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Wilson Center.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley. This is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to check out the Are We Safer Today documentary film. In it, the 9/11 commissioners discuss their historic work, what they did, and how they did it. Available in broadcast or streaming from your local public television station or pbs.org/video. Special thanks to the Center on Representative Government at Indiana University, along with Paul and Cindy Simon Scott and the Sumerian Foundation. Are We Safer Today is a production of Naptown Media. Executive producer Bob Massey. Produced by Shelby Hiltunen with associate producer Emily Twergle. Editors Matt Massey and PJ Wilson. Recorded at Interface Media Group in Washington, D.C. with sound engineer Dennis Jacobson. Thanks to Sarah Jackson and Grant McPollen. Theme music by House Music and Sound.